Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Mike Green of the United States Studies Center in Sydney and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green. I'm joined by one of the true giants in American diplomacy in the modern era, Ambassador Nicholas Burns. Nick is the Roy and Barbara Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at Harvard at the Kennedy School. He also co-leads the Aspen Strategy Group with my old boss, Condoleezza Rice. I have the great privilege of being part of that group and has returned from a distinguished tour as the U.S. Ambassador to China from 2021 to 2025. Nick, it's a real privilege to have you on.
Mike, it's great to be with you. I only wish we could be in Sydney right now, one of the great cities in the world, and at your university, but looking forward to this conversation.
We will work on making that happen. I always start because people are interested to learn how you got here. I know you went to SAIS, so you are my senpai in the SAIS world, but I want to ask it a little differently. You've had some pretty tough, challenging, exciting jobs, ambassador to NATO. You led, and I got to go along for the ride when we worked on transforming our relationship with India and the Bush administration, undersecretary. But ambassador to China must have been one of the most challenging of all. Are there certain professors or senior diplomats who you found yourself leaning on, whose words of wisdom came back, and you realize, maybe decades later, boy, they had a point. I'm really glad they taught me?
Well, Mike, thank you, first of all, for having me on your podcast. Yeah, I had a long diplomatic career. I started in 1980 as a 24-year-old intern in the tiny American embassy in Nouakchott, Mauritania. I served in West Africa, the Middle East, spoke Arabic. 40 years ago, spoke Arabic in Cairo and Jerusalem. Spent a lot of time working on the Soviet Union and then Russia and Ukraine when they succeeded the Soviet Union, and then on to NATO and China. So a long career. And I would say that my ambassadorship to China was probably the most challenging job that I had in all that time. And like you, we all lean on the people who helped us learn and helped us become professionals and who were our mentors when we were younger. When I was at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Robert R. Osgood was the former dean, legendary professor of American foreign policy. He wrote a great book called Ideals and Self-Interest in American Foreign Policy, all about the trade-offs that we have had, particularly in the 20th century, between our ideals in honoring them and sometimes our more practical interests, whether it's energy or military. And so that book and that Professor Osgood, had a big impact on me. I think in my career, Mike, Condi Rice and Colin Powell and the late Frank Wisner, great American diplomat, were all kind of took me under their wings. Condi and I were the two-person Soviet team on the NSC staff for President George H.W. Bush when the Cold War was ending in 1990, 91, and on. And I stayed on and was special assistant to President Clinton for those countries when they emerged from the Soviet Union. And Condi, you and I worked for her. When she was Secretary of State, I was her undersecretary and handled the daily diplomacy for her. So she made a big impact on me. We're still very close friends. As you say, we co-chair the Aspen Strategy Group together. And it was her combination of analytical brilliance, strategic foresight, particularly about the Soviets and about the fragility of their system, and the fact that she's also just a great human being has made her a lifelong friend and mentor. And from Colin Powell, I worked for Secretary Powell when I was ambassador to NATO. I was there on 9/11. I was there when the Allies invoked Article 5 to defend us, which I think the framers of NATO never would have imagined. The assumption was the United States and Canada would have to go across the pond a third time in the 20th century to defend Europe against Stalin or Khrushchev. And the great irony is that it really took an attack on the United States, on our homeland, on New York and Washington, to bring the Allies to invoke Article 5. And I've never forgotten that. And it really, Mike, was a lifelong lesson that the United States is very powerful in the world, but we're much more powerful and resilient when we work with allies like Australia, like Japan, South Korea, our partner in India, and certainly our NATO allies. So it's been a long career, and all those experiences formed the basis of how I approached the big problem set of China.
There used to be a debate on China policy. Maybe I remember when I was working for the McCain campaign, Jeff Bader, who was working for Obama, and I had this debate. Do you manage China from the inside out by getting the perfect deal with China bilaterally, or from the outside in by leveraging your allies, your partners? And I think that debate's been over for some time.
Yeah.
And you probably felt that in Beijing.
I sure did.
So you worked with some incredible people. I also worked for Connie for 4.5 years. The word Renaissance person doesn't even do justice to her
Right.
multifaceted talents. World-class ice skater, pianist, Sovietologist, just amazing. One of my favorite stories of the George Herbert Walker Bush NSC is one that Bob Blackwell tells, because he was your boss, right? He was the senior director.
He was
overseeing
nominally
you
our
and Condi.
boss, yes.
He tells the story of going in to introduce you and Condi to President Bush 41, George Herbert Walker Bush, and saying, "This is Nick Burns and Connie Rice. They're fantastic. I always make it a point to hire people who are smarter than I am." And then apparently Brent Scowcroft said, "Well, then how do you narrow the field?" I don't know if that's a true story or not. Bob tells it himself. But it was quite a team. And this is as the Soviet Union was collapsing and managing that transition, one of the most important diplomatic events of recent time. I was in the White House on 9/11. John Howard, the Prime Minister of Australia, of course, was in Washington. And he also invoked ANZUS, the U.S.-Australia Treaty. Very emotional moment for the same reason. The founders envisioned us going across the other pond to defend Australia or Japan. And here Australia, in the heat of the moment with their prime minister in Washington, told the president, "We're going to invoke ANZUS." And it was an emotional moment. I remember senior military people getting quite, crying, frankly, to think about what that meant at a time when as you will recall, we were scared and felt a little bit alone for a moment. And then the Allies came in. Let me ask about China. Let's focus on China a bit now. First of all, reflecting on your 4 years there, sort of in historical perspective, where are we in U.S. China relations? Are things stabilizing after the tariff wars? The Thucydides trap, we're on a steady trajectory towards, military confrontation. How would you characterize broadly where we are with China after your 4 years in Beijing?
Mike, I don't think that we are on a trajectory of inevitable conflict. There's always human agency. There's always leadership on both sides that would drive down the probability of a conflict. And I don't believe either the Chinese government, certainly not the American government under either President Trump or President Biden, wants a conflict or intends to have one. And so what we tried to do in the Biden administration, I certainly tried in leading the American embassy, the American mission in China, is to manage a very complicated relationship. And I would say that there's no question that competition is going to drive this relationship for the next 10 years or more. It certainly drives it now. We're competing for military power in the Indo-Pacific. China's trying to divide us from our treaty allies like Australia, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, and from India, our strategic partner. We're competing for technological power in AI, quantum computing, biotech. We're competing on trade and tariffs. That's most visible now as you reflect on the phone conversation that President Xi and President Trump just had and think about the fact they're going to meet in South Korea on the margins of the APEC meeting in about a month's time, that they've agreed to have 2 summit meetings next year. So a very competitive relationship. And of course, we're competing because we have diametrically opposed views on human freedom and the value of human beings and the individual rights they should have. So I think this is a structural rivalry, that this competitive nature of the relationship, 2 largest economies, 2 strongest militaries, the 2 countries with greatest global reach, and both of us want to be number one. And so I think that competition will define this relationship for a long time. And that's how we saw it in the administration. The Chinese were frustrated by this. They used to tell me, "Why can't you agree that our framework for this relationship should be win-win?" And I would say, because that's not what this relationship is all about. You're modernizing the PLA. You're engaged in this enormous military buildup. You're pushing out against the Philippines and the South China Sea, against Japan and the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. You're causing problems for the Koreans in the Yellow Sea. You cause a lot of problems for the Indians along your 3,000-kilometer border where you don't recognize their sovereignty in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. How can we have a win-win relationship if that's what you're up to? And so we felt that was an honest way of telling ourselves and telling the Chinese, we are in a competitive framework. Therefore, we're going to compete with each other. And they certainly compete with us. And so we've both got to be cognizant of that and have sufficient channels of communication between the presidents, between ambassadors, between foreign ministers, but especially between military officers, so that we can make sure that if there's, God forbid, two planes collide or naval vessels collide, we can intervene and lower the temperature and separate the people who've collided. Because I'm convinced, Mike, that neither leadership wants a conflict, and they shouldn't in the nuclear, cyber, AI age. So competition, I think, is a defining feature. But what makes the relationship so sometimes confounding and highly difficult to manage is that while we're competing with each other, our interests align on certain global issues. President Trump has pulled us out of the Paris Agreement, but President Biden believed, and I think he was correct in this, that climate change is real and that we have to work with China, with Australia, with Japan, with India, with the Europeans to diminish carbon emissions on all sides. We have a fentanyl problem in the United States. It's the leading cause of death in our society. The majority of the precursor chemicals that make up the synthetic opioid come from the Chinese black market. We need to work with China on that. If there's another pandemic, law of averages would say there will be sometime soon. This time we should try to work with China, not against China or China against us. So our biggest competitor in the world is China, but we also have to work with China. And I guess that's point two. And point three would be President Biden was very clear that the end state here is peace with China, not war with China. President Trump is very clear about that in statement after statement. And frankly, that gives me confidence that, we have to compete, but we also have to use an old Cold War word from the old Cold War, we have to coexist with each other. So that would be my summary of what President Biden tried to do in office. It's not dissimilar from what President Trump is doing. Now, there are differences, obviously, particularly on trade, on tariffs. President Biden didn't put 145% tariffs on China, but he did put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs and 50% in semiconductors and 25% in lithium batteries. And, we implemented in the Biden administration all of President Trump's first phase one trade tariffs on China. So I actually would sometimes tell the Chinese when they would tell me how divided my own country was, I'd say, yeah, but on the issue of China, I have a united Republican and Democratic Party behind me. And that was actually, frankly, a good source of strength as I dueled with the Chinese throughout my time there.
So 20 years ago, when I was on the NSC staff as the senior director for Asia, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, their summits with President Bush, and I suspect with President Obama, were, we'd sort of look at the ledger sheet. We'd say, on North Korea, we're actually more cooperative than competitive on, even APEC. So there was the ledger sheet, maybe it was 60% competition, 40% rivalry, something like that. Now it's got to be about 80 or 90% competition and about 10 or 20% cooperation opportunities with things like climate change or the importance of fentanyl. But 15, 20 years ago, we didn't see Beijing holding up one area they didn't cross-link. They didn't cross-link North Korea cooperation for action on Taiwan. And it seems from the outside like the dynamic has shifted. Getting cooperation on the areas you mentioned is not something that Beijing is doing on the merits alone. They want something for it. It's much more transactional. It's much more zero-sum, which is maddening because something like fentanyl, the Chinese should be helping stop deaths, not make it a condition or condition that on us doing things anyway. So am I right about that? Has it become much more zero-sum and transactional and things that on their merits are worth doing, Beijing isn't willing to do without getting something in exchange?
Mike, you're right about that. The relationship is far more difficult to manage than it was. I mean, to take up your point, when I was Undersecretary of State for President Bush and Secretary Condi Rice, I negotiated for the United States 4 Security Council Chapter 7 sanctions resolutions against Iran. And guess who was on my side of the table, our side of the table? China. We worked very well with China, with Sui Chongkai, who was then my counterpart. You know him well. When we initiated the 6-party talks, and you were a big part of that, we were working with China. After the North Korea nuclear test in 2007, I flew to China, as well as Japan and South Korea, and the Chinese, and we had similar views. We were against North Korea advancing its nuclear program. So things have changed. I think what changed it most, for most of us, at least in the United States, was the big Chinese push for power under President Xi, so different than President Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin in the South China Sea. And, the building up of islands and islets and taking other people's property 500, 600, 700 miles out in the South China Sea, very far from China's own borders under the law of the Sea Agreement. And the fact that, we didn't push back during the Obama years and early Trump years. And I think both Republican and Democratic parties have been hardened. I myself have been hardened. I first went to China in 1988 as a young Foreign Service officer with George Shultz, who was our great Secretary of State, who I think really understood Asia. And, we saw China very differently under Deng Xiaoping, whom Secretary Shultz met in that trip. I went back with President H.W. Bush in February of '89, his first trip, and went back many, many times to China in those years. And like most American diplomats, Republican or Democratic, I was a career Foreign Service officer, we were in an engagement mode with China. But things really changed. When the PLA began to modernize in a non-transparent way, see us as the big rival, try to intimidate their territorial neighbors. And then when China became such an aggressive cyber power, and this all happened under President Obama's first and second term, President Trump's, and into President Biden. So when I went to China, I was confirmed in 2021 by the Senate. I would describe myself as hawkish on China. And I think everybody I knew in both parties was hawkish in our government, and many people between in Tokyo and Seoul and Manila.
The public opinion polls are pretty remarkable. We do polling at our center, the Lowy Institute, Chicago Council, and they're all pretty consistent. They show that, the U.S., Europe, Japan, Canada, Australia, views of China are largely aligned. Yeah. And the closer you are to China, if you're Japan or Korea or India, the more hawkish you are. And as a result, even with all the uncertainty and unpleasantness about the Trump tariffs and so forth, support for alliances with the U.S. in Asia may be different for NATO right now, but in Asia, support for alliance with the U.S. in Japan, Korea, Australia hasn't moved. The trust in the U.S. is the lowest it's been in decades, but support for the alliance hasn't moved. And as Joe Biden said, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the other guy. And the other guy is pretty menacing. But it does make you worry a little bit, doesn't it? Because we talked when you were in Beijing, and allies were such a force multiplier for you as a diplomat, as it would have been for your friend Scott Stewart from Australia or the British ambassador. And right now, it looks like a lot of disarray in alliances, tariffs and all sorts of disagreements about approaches to Ukraine. What do you think Beijing is looking at right now at this moment? Do you think they see an opportunity, or are they smart enough to know the structure of these alliances is stronger than it may look on the surface?
Well, Mike, when I left China in January and came home to resign before President Trump's inauguration, The Economist magazine called me and said, would you publish, this was February, would you publish an article in our magazine? What did you learn? What are your takeaways from your time there? And I wrote that article, and one of the big takeaways from my time, I think of it as be nice to your allies. The United States and China are peer powers. If you measure the power of the U.S. and China in military, tech, economic, soft power terms, I think the United States, and I think the Chinese would say this, is probably more powerful, but it's close. But if you add to our side of the ledger, Japan, Australia, South Korea, the Philippines, strategic partner India, not a treaty ally, but a big strategic partner. And then, Mike, to see during my time there how active the European Union was on all sorts of issues. Taiwan, very critical of the Chinese support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Chinese military assistance to Russia for that war. And I really felt that we were so much more successful in limiting the worst aspects of Chinese behavior when we had the allies by our side. And I guess I learned this lesson early on in 9/11 as NATO ambassador. When the allies came to our defense, we talked about that. But I learned it in spades in China. I worked with two really fine Australian ambassadors to China, Graham Fletcher and Scott Dewar, both of them China experts, both of them magnificent Mandarin speakers, both of them with decades of experience in the country. Scott also with Japan. And, we were as close as professional colleagues as we could possibly be. We didn't have identical views on every issue between Australia and the United States, but we had a strong uniformity of views. And I really leaned on them. And I think there are times maybe they leaned on me, but I leaned on them. I can tell you that. And I really admired the steadfastness and the clarity of purpose of the Australian government. Same is true of my Japanese colleagues, my South Korean colleagues, my Indian colleagues, my Filipino colleagues, incredible ambassador who'd lived for 50 years in China, really understood them. And so I think as the United States approaches this extraordinarily difficult challenge of competing with China and yet finding a way to keep the peace in the Indo-Pacific, we are much stronger with our allies. And President Biden was very successful in this because he believed in the alliances. He built them up. We expanded. Of course, we originated AUKUS, and the quartet met at the head of government level in a very meaningful way. So I really think that the United States should always remember that our allies are the foundation of our power in the Indo-Pacific. And I worry when I see President Trump criticizing Canada. We couldn't have a better ally than Canada. I live in Boston. We're just 6 hours from Montreal by car, and we know the Canadians well. And to question their sovereignty is wrong on every dimension, but it's also not smart if you want to keep Canada as an ally of the United States. The same with Denmark. The administration's been criticizing the Danes because of the alleged mismanagement of Greenland. This would have been unthinkable for every president from Harry Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, every Republican and Democratic president. So my big takeaway from my time in China is we need the allies, and particularly Australia. And I'm not just saying that because, you're sitting at the University of Sydney, but I think pound for pound, we couldn't have a better ally than Australia. And it's so important that the United States understand that. I think the people of the United States understand it. I think people like you and I who have served in government for both parties, as I certainly have done, understand it. But I worry about our current administration and, its ambivalence, frankly, about alliances. I worry about putting 35% tariffs, 35% on Tokyo and Seoul, Japan and South Korea, when we really need them. And India at 50%, we really need them on the China policy, which is so much more important than the level of tariffs.
We have Chinese delegations from think tanks come through Australia, people well. I meet with them. I think they know that despite the political and tariff friction of Australia with the U.S., or for that matter, Korea or Japan, they can also see things like Talisman Sabre, 45,000 troops exercising in Australia from U.S. allies and partners, and AUKUS and the upgrading of the U.S. command in Japan. They can see all that. So they'll exploit it, is my sense. But for now, at least, they see there is some structure to this. The one that is most perplexing of all, though, is India. And you were really at the epicenter of what became the modern U.S.-India strategic relationship, what we used to call the NSSP. It's really kind of too bad we had to come up with a boring acronym for what was actually quite a dramatic strategic
Next steps in strategic partnership.
That's it, NSSP. Very Steve Hadley to come up with a very lawyerly acronym. We needed something more dramatic, but it was dramatic. And, over the 20-some years since that effort, the U.S. exercises more with India than the rest of the world combined. I mean, just incredible strategic partnership for a country that is notionally not aligned. The combination of the 50% tariffs, the president's anger at Modi for not supporting him for the Nobel Peace Prize like Pakistan did, and then Modi going to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which I think he was going to anyway. But that whole package looked to a lot of people like we've lost India. Is that your view? Have we lost India, or is it just a bad row?
I don't think we've lost India. I've been paying close attention to the Indian press and, to people I really trust and admire in the Indian government. They don't believe that they're permanently separate from us, but they've been badly hurt by this. Every American president since Bill Clinton has had the following belief, that the rise of India as a strategic power in the Indo-Pacific and indeed in the world is in the strategic interests of the United States, and it is. And so I'm against the tariff policy to begin with of President Trump, but to exercise it against India for the reasons that you suggested, non-economic reasons, makes no sense when it drives Prime Minister Modi, to obviously take a cautious attitude towards the United States. And I think this is recoverable. Both President Trump and Prime Minister Modi have exchanged pleasantries publicly. I know that Secretary Marco Rubio is meeting Foreign Minister Jai Shankar this week at the UN General Assembly at UNGA. And I really hope that they can refloat this relationship because it is so critical and central to everything we're trying to do to achieve in the Indo-Pacific. So I think the Indians have not yet given up on the United States, the government of India, but the people of India, the Indian public, they've been listening to the rhetoric from the administration, which has been quite dismissive of India as a great power and as an economic trading power of the United States. So I think it's one of the most damaging things that the administration has done and one of the most misguided since taking office. The Quad, where India and Australia and Japan, the United States gets together, we started that, Mike, in the Bush administration. We couldn't meet at the foreign minister level because some of the other countries, didn't want to have that kind of challenge to China. Now we're now meeting at the head of government level. And that relationship between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump is critical, and President Trump needs to make this right.
I agree with you. It is the biggest on-site goal so far, at least in the Indo-Pacific, by this administration. But the structure behind this relationship is also considerable. The Indian diaspora, it's the most influential caucus in Congress after APAC.
Yep.
The economic interests, the military and diplomatic interests, the fact that all of our allies, Australia, Japan, and the Quad, want this relationship back on track. But we have a hole we have to climb out of. That is for sure. You mentioned earlier that your Chinese counterparts would often point to American polarization and division as a weakness, which is so interesting. You invited Robert Kagan to Aspen. He gave a talk on his theory of the America trap, that authoritarian regimes look at debate in the United States and see it as weakness and make the mistake of, moving against the U.S. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Hitler, Tojo, Kim Il-sung, to their great detriment. I mean, it's not surprising that Chinese counterparts would say you're divided and so on and so forth. Do you think that your counterparts understood the U.S. in reality? I mean, I'm not surprised they would throw this at you, but, in a moment of great power competition, the ability to read the other side matters.
Yes, it does.
Connections, as you know, between think tanks, universities, the presence of law firms and consultancies in Beijing has just dried up. The number of students going to Beijing has dried up. Georgetown, where I taught, students who wanted to go in the Foreign Service would go to China to learn Mandarin. Now they have to go to Taipei. So a lot of these connections have weakened, but there's also a lot of expertise in China, as you know. Do you think they read the U.S. right now? Or do you think they're falling into the America trap?
I think that's a very central question. I mean, as a diplomat, as the former ambassador there, it was our job to make sure that the Chinese leadership fully understood our intentions, what was vital for us, what our differences were. I think in one sense, Mike, in China, the rise of a lot of these think tanks in Beijing and Shanghai, and they all report to the party or the military. My interaction with these and professors and deans and presidents of universities, I think there are many Chinese who are remarkably sophisticated in their understanding of the United States and Australia and Japan. And I've always been impressed for 35 years by the quality of people in the Chinese diplomatic corps. Their language ability, their sophistication, their international exposure and experience, they're really first-rate adversaries, competitors, if you want to use rivals, pick the word. I wonder sometimes about the top of the leadership of the Communist Party. If you look at the biographies of the Standing Committee, the top 7 leaders in China, of the Politburo, the 24 members of the Politburo, the 205 members of the Central Committee, most of these people do not have significant international exposure. They have not studied at ANU or the University of Sydney or at Harvard, where I teach. And you see that in your interactions with them. Many of them are like American leaders. They don't speak a foreign language. And so I wonder sometimes if at that very key central top level of the government, of the Communist Party, they really do understand our culture. In Australia, the United States, for instance, and they might misconstrue, the divided nature of American politics right now, the red-blue divide socially and culturally, and say, well, the United States is weak and fading and it'll never be again what it was. And I think that would be tremendously, first of all, wrong analytically. I think there's a redemptive quality in the United States, and that we will, I would hope very much, bounce back to a different way of thinking about the rest of the world. But I'm not sure the top leadership gets that. So that's one point. The other point I would add, Mike, is that it's very important as we compete with China that we keep our societies linked together. And I know you agree with this because we've talked about it, but we have 273,000 Chinese students in the United States, and they're not only just welcome here, it's important that they're here. It's important that our students study with them and get to know them, and that our students gain a real appreciation for how the Chinese think about the world and their role in it. We're down to 1,105 American students in China, down from 15,000 10 years ago. We actually went down to 350 during the worst days of zero COVID when China was pretty much closed. And I really worried about that as ambassador, and I worry about it now as a university professor, that we need American students who can speak Mandarin. I had the great fortune of having an embassy and consulates filled with American diplomats who were on their third, fourth, or fifth tour living in China. They all spoke Mandarin beautifully. They understood the culture. That's critical. It's critical to be effective as a diplomat and as a government in understanding the other country. And I worry if we're down to 1,105 students in China now, the American ambassador 10 or 15 years ago will not have the deep bench, the number of people who can speak Mandarin and understand the country that I was very lucky to have. So I think keeping tourists, interacting with each other's countries, students, businesses, universities, not backing away from having seminars and conferences, this is really critical to prevent a psychosis that develops, where because you're isolated from another country and your society is not in contact, you begin to demonize them. And, I am old enough to remember the old Cold War. My first 10 years of my career were the last 10 years of the Cold War. And we had developed such a psychosis about the Soviet peoples and about Mao's China. And it was not healthy, and they had the same psychosis about us because we literally didn't know each other. So I think a hard-headed approach to China should be, for our national interest, compete government to government, but keep our people connected to China and keep Chinese people connected to us.
It sounds probably a little dissonant to some, maybe some in Congress, that you would do that. But the way you articulate it, it's not about some idealistic view of human happiness and kumbaya. It's raw calculation of U.S. national interest that we need this insight. Yeah.
And who agrees with this sentiment is President Trump. So when he said about a month ago, we should have, someone told him there were 300,000 Chinese students in the United States, just shy of it. He said we should have 600,000. And I thought, good for President Trump for recognizing this is part of human nature, that, we're not going to understand each other if we don't know each other. And that's part of politics. That's part of diplomacy.
Let me go back briefly before we finish to your point that the Standing Committee of the Politburo just does not have the international experience or exposure needed for this challenging time in U.S. China relations and China's role in the world. Who do they listen to? Presumably Wang Yi, the foreign minister, he's a Japan expert, as you know. He actually spent 3 months in Georgetown. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs used to send their number 2 Asia hand, usually a Japan or Korea expert, to Georgetown. And so I met Wang Yi and others when they were mid-career. But I'm thinking also about Wang Hunin, who, as an academic, purported to know the U.S., but was extremely—
long time ago, 45 years ago.
And is a declinist about the U.S. and sort of the East is rising, the West is declining, all that. Does he matter, or who's getting through to them, do you think?
Well, Wang Huning has now survived as the party propagandist, if you will, strategist for 3 Chinese presidents, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping. So obviously he's got great influence, one would think. And he's ranked, number 4, I think, in the Standing Committee now. I think Wang Yi is a very sophisticated, very intelligent, exceedingly experienced diplomat. I think we found in our meetings with him that we often disagreed, but you could have an extended discussion of strategy, and you could make the effort to try to make him understand, and we would listen to him as well. What's at the root of their fears, or their strategy towards us, or we towards them? How might we mitigate those fears? How might we stabilize the relationship? He is a very impressive person, and I think he does have a lot of influence in the government of China. they have exceptionally fine people. Ma Jiashu is the number 2 in the foreign ministry, who is he's an expert on Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom. He knows the great powers well. He knows Asia well. Xie Feng, who's the ambassador here, former vice foreign minister. Cui Tongkai, I think, is one of the most effective Chinese diplomats, probably of my generation, as I've worked with them. And he is now retired, but they, of course, ask him to take on semi-official diplomatic missions, and he often is a conduit to, and he was 7 years ambassador in the United States under both President Obama and President Trump. So a lot of people here know him. And these are people who, the quality of these diplomats is very high. They're impressive people. I had very good, respectful relations with them, but there were times when it got heated. And sometimes there's a performative part of Chinese behavior at the negotiating table where they feign outrage. And when Xie Feng, when he left Beijing to become ambassador to Washington, I had a dinner for him. And he said at the dinner, his staff had counted that he and I had had 24 meetings in, I think, 9 months. And the average length of the meetings was 3 hours. So you can imagine how highly theological these debates became under Taiwan. I know, Mike, you've been all through this in your career, so it sounds very familiar to you. But this is what it takes to understand the government. And so obviously I was willing to sit through any length of a meeting if I could gain a better appreciation of where they were coming from, but also give them a very stern sense of our opposition. For instance, the balloon incident, their overreaction to Speaker Pelosi's visit 3 years ago to Taiwan, their push for power against the Philippines in the summer of 2024 when the Chinese Coast Guard and Navy ramming Filipino ships and fishing vessels and contesting Filipino sovereignty at 3 different atolls in clearly Filipino territory. We had some very tough conversations. And getting to know them made it possible for us to, and for me as ambassador, to pass very tough messages that I had high reason to believe they understood.
I am guessing that no State Department official ever handed you a memo telling you how many meetings you'd had and how many hours they were on average. That is...
Because we couldn't probably... the Chinese keep exquisite track, as you know, of the number of meetings you had and how long they were and who was at the table. I give you an interesting story. When Secretary Kissinger came out to China, he was 100 years of age. This is just 3 months before he passed away. And I met him at the airport. It was about, I think it was 41 degrees centigrade. It was steaming hot in the middle of the Beijing summer. And I said, do you want to go back to the hotel and rest? He said, no, let's go. Let's have the meetings. And when they honored him at Diaoyutai State Guest House, they reproduced the menu that Zhou Enlai had ordered for the meeting, his dinner with President Nixon back in February 1972. I thought to myself, when Secretary Kissinger told me that, I thought, I'm not sure that the State Department has any record of a dinner that we gave for a Chinese leader in the 1980s or 90s, maybe even into this century. So you got to admire the keen attention to detail, to history that the Chinese have, and we have to match it to be their equal.
Nick Burns, thanks so much. It was a great discussion. President Biden was wise and lucky to have you in that post. I think we all were. I think you make an excellent point about the bipartisanship around China policy in the U.S., despite everything else, and the importance of knowing history, of going to China, of students learning Chinese, of learning Mandarin, and that it is possible to have diplomacy and competition and tension at the same time. In fact, that's why you need diplomacy. So wonderful distillation of all of that. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Mike, it was an honor to be American ambassador. And now that I'm back at a university, it's great to be working with you again. And congratulations for everything you're doing at the University of Sydney and for CSIS. And thank you for this interesting discussion.
Thank you.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.